Good afternoon, and I'd like to welcome you to this luncheon keynote address. My name is Eric Varvel. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the investment bank at Credit Suisse. We have an eminent speaker, Paul Conway of Cargill, who you'll meet in just a moment. Mr. Conway is a vice chairman of Cargill. Cargill is one of the largest food producers and traders in the world, which puts Mr. Conway in a unique position to discuss the prospects for global food supply and prices. They both affect every dimension of the economy and the social and political framework of every nation, and in particular, in the emerging markets, where food represents a very large portion of household expenditure. The economic development of the emerging markets across the globe, and in Asia-Pacific specifically, is rapidly changing, and the demand equation for certain foods as well. At the same time, the trend in prices of traditional food provisions is a critical component of civil order and sustainable prosperity. With a distinguished career of more than 30 years in the food industry, Paul Conway is an expert on the topic of food security, and will have important insights to share on the ramification of recent global economic development. It is my privilege to have Mr. Conway here. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Conway to the stand.
Before I begin, are there any farmers in the room? We have one over there. So on behalf of the rest of us, thank you for the great job that you and the other 999,999, there's about 1 billion farmers in the world. Congratulations and thank you for all that you do for us here as we tuck in. Pascal Lamy was at an economist conference recently in Geneva. He's the Director General of the World Trade Organization, so has a great overview of all aspects of business. And he called out agriculture and agribusiness as the most complex business that there is in the world. So think about that. What you're eating today has come from an incredibly complex supply chain with everything that every other business has, plus the weather. So, we know what the challenge is. In the next 30 years, the world is going to add 2.2, 2.3 billion people. In addition to that, the amount of food that they will need is about 60 to 70%, estimates vary, more than there is today, because as GDP per capita increases, you see an intensification of diet. So if somebody has a kilo of grain and they go to a kilo of beef, it takes about 8 kilos of grain to produce a kilo of beef. And so the world is getting worried. Can we do it? Can this planet, can the 999,999 farmers, other than this gentleman over there, can they respond and produce that amount of food? Or are we going to go into a Malthusian situation where the planet runs out of food? So I have one slide that I would like to share with you, if that can be put up. And so this is a summary of what the problem is. You can see that the bars represent 5-year periods, and you can see over the last 30 or 40 years, since the 60s and the 70s, the height of the Green Revolution, you've seen the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, North America, relatively stable, Latin America, a huge success story, produce the food that goes to feed the developing world, particularly in Asia and the Middle East and Africa. That essentially is what Cargill does. We move those surpluses to those areas of deficit. And the interesting thing about this is that you have a part of the world where land is in surplus versus the demands of the people, and 2 other parts of the world, Middle East, Africa, and Asia, where the reverse is true. And people are concerned, despite the fact, despite the fact that this has been done successfully for over 40 years, that the next 25 years is going to be different, that we won't be able to continue to do it. So another comment that Pascal Lamy made was, all we have to do in the next decade and a half is produce the Brazilian success story in Africa. A task that is very large but not insurmountable. So can we do it? At Cargill, our view is a resounding yes. So I am the House skeptic. It's one of my roles as a Brit in this positive Midwest company. But our view is that we can do this. We can produce enough food to feed those extra 2 billion people, including the fact that their incomes will rise and they will have a more intensive diet. There is no shortage of food today in the world. You have roughly 1 billion people are overweight, and you have 1 billion people, according to the FAO, who are undernourished. If you take the FAO, and no one in this room, I would add, is one of those, clearly. If you take the FAO stats, about 975 million people undernourished, and you take the amount of grain it would take to provide them with reasonable nourishment, that adds up to about 30 to 35 million tons of grain. Last year, in 2011, the world converted 180 million tons of grains and sugars into biofuels. So there is plenty of food in the world. The key, we believe, is that governments institute a series of policies that will enable the world's billion farmers to provide that food. The right policies can provide the right environment, which means the job will be doable. The converse is also true. So what are those policies? The first and the most important is land rights. It sounds easy, but there are many parts of the world, including some not so far from here, where farmers are thrown off the land and land is converted into building land. That's a problem, but it goes beyond that. Even if the farmers are not thrown off the land, if they don't have clear land rights, what do they use for collateral? How do they borrow against that land? How do they have the confidence to invest if they don't have clear title to the land? So land rights, particularly in the developing world, is an absolutely critical part of improving agricultural productivity. The second one is that farmers are free to plant the right crops on their land for its agronomic and weather conditions, that they're not directed into something that is inappropriate. Again, sounds simple. Third one, very important, is that farmers are free to receive market signals. And incredibly exciting things are happening today. There is a mango exchange in Ethiopia that has just started. Farmers, I keep saying this, they're very smart people. Japanese farmers formed futures markets 400 years ago. So if price signals get through to farmers, they do react to them. They do put that extra fertilizer on in order to improve their yields. Governments, again, can intervene in a way that destroys that price signal. So governments around the world, in many occasions, worried about the urban poor, who frequently have a tendency to riot, will artificially hold down prices. Perfectly understandable why they would do that, but that destroys the incentive for their farmers to produce. Very short-sighted policy. The fourth one is we've lived through a world since the 60s, certainly in the developed world, where food is an ever-decreasing part of the household budget. We've seen deflating food prices year after year after year in the developed world. And that has meant that food has been off the agenda of governments largely. That means that there has been a decline for a generation in public sector research into agriculture and agribusiness. That needs to be reversed. Whether that is through technology, infrastructure, or irrigation, what I'll call hard infrastructure, but there are other items as well, soft infrastructure. In the US, they're called extension services, so it's training farmers in great husbandry for animals or great agricultural techniques. It also, by the way, involves the embracement of new technologies, such as genetic modification, and I'm sure there'll be a few questions about that afterwards. So reversing that decline And it's probably a good point to mention now that the G20, which didn't exist pre-2007, from its formation, food security was number one on their agenda. Now, the financial crisis, particularly in Europe, has sort of knocked it to one side a little bit, but the focus of governments worldwide, whether it's China, whether it's Europe, Singapore, former Soviet Union, food security has regained its rightful place on the agendas of many governments. And so that will lead to more investment. Infrastructure is vital. You see in a lot of places that people say in India, for example, 40% of food is wasted. My Indian colleagues say that's not true. It's not wasted. It just doesn't get its optimum price. It goes to a lower priced usage. If you look at this slide, it demonstrates world trade in foodstuffs. But the fact is only 14% of foodstuffs are traded internationally. 86% is consumed where it's eaten. To feed those extra 2 billion people with the more intensive diets, it is inevitable that the proportion of food that flows across international borders will increase. There is no more land available in Southeast Asia. There is plenty of land available in the Western Hemisphere in Africa. What does that mean? It means that it's even more essential that we have a free and open rules-based trading system so that those surpluses can move to the areas of deficit. It's why it's so disappointing as a company that we find the Doha round of the World Trade talks has made so little progress. And for countries in Asia, they need to understand that their voice needs to be higher, pushing for this. As part of that, we'd also like to see the harmonization of food safety standards, not to a US model. We support the Codex Alimentarius, a Paris-based organization, so that you don't have trade barriers replaced by what are called phytosanitary barriers. So these are not revolutionary. If you talk to most economists, if you talk to most ministers of agriculture, they would acknowledge that they would agree with them. But for some reason, the dial doesn't move. There's also a number of myths, and I thought I'd take this opportunity to explode a few of them. The first is that food safety is the same as food self-sufficiency. It's not. They're very different. An example I use, Cargill is headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, coldest place on earth, January, February, March, but it is technically possible under glass to produce all the orange juice needed in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It would be complete economic nonsense. So produce what is the right thing to produce, trade the surpluses in a rules-based open trading system. Don't try and be self-sufficient in everything. The Chinese government made a very wise decision in 1998 that they weren't going to be able to be self-sufficient in grain and vegetable protein. They chose to go with grain, and they import about 80% of the vegetable protein in the way of largely soybeans from Brazil, Argentina, and the US. The second myth is that the private sector is the problem. The private sector is not the problem. As all of you would agree, we're part of the solution. The third one, and this is particularly as a European, you hear this a lot, that productivity is the enemy of sustainability. In order to be sustainable, we've all got to go back to eating food made 5 miles away. The most sustainable form of agriculture is good quality land, well-maintained, with great seeds, minimal inputs, that's harvested using great technology, that is then processed in factories that have the highest yields with 0 emissions. I mean, that's a great definition of sustainability. And then finally, you lot, that if only financial speculation would go away, everything would be fine. So it's all your fault, basically. These are some of the myths that you find when Cargill has decided we're going to take a more public view, trying to argue the points for good policy. These are some of the arguments that get in the way of it. So I'll summarize. The world can feed 2 billion people and feed them with a diet that is better than the one that their parents had. What we need to do is empower farmers, provide them with the right tools, provide them with the right policy environment, and then they will do the job. They've been doing rather well for the last couple of millennia. Thank you very much indeed. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bob Murley. I'm a Vice Chairman of Credit Suisse. I also have the great privilege of leading the Cargill relationship at our firm. I've worked with Cargill for over 25 years now, although I'd be quick to point out that our firm's relationship with Cargill dates back over 50 years, long before I was born, of course. But anyway, it's my role here today is to serve as a moderator, and I hope there'll be a lot of questions here in the crowd. I think that, first of all, I want to thank Paul for the very insightful comments that you've made. We're really very grateful that someone with his expertise and knowledge would travel here to share his knowledge with all of us. And I just, we have microphones around the room, and if you raise your hand, we can get right to it. Maybe I'll take the liberty of the prerogative of the moderator to at least kick it off with the first question while some of you are gathering your thoughts. You know, there's a commonly held view in the West that the water table is sinking here in China, and that sustainable agrarian practices are not being employed broadly. Do you think that's a fair assessment? And what's the outlook for sustainable practices, farming practices here in China?
So 2 parts of the question. Is the water table in China decreasing? The answer is yes, and the Chinese government are very worried about it. I believe that they're doing their own research into drought-resistant varieties of many of the main crops. It's not the only part of the world where water is a problem, and companies that use a lot of water, like Coca-Cola, it's number 1 on their sustainability agenda. As regards Chinese farmers, they do a lot of double cropping, 2 crops a year, and that's tough on the soil, but in terms of things like their fertilizer usage, it's actually pretty high. So I don't think that the Chinese farmer, their methodology is unsustainable. I think there is an issue about whether they are using and embracing technology, all the technologies that are available, satellite mapping of soils so you get the right application, you don't just do a broad brush. For example. But the water is clearly a big issue in China, and it's not just for agriculture, for other things as well. I mean, if you've ever been in Beijing, when you get one of those sandstorms coming in, it's not a lot of fun.
Let's go to the audience.
Thank you, Paul. That was a very interesting speech. I have 3 questions. First of all, if you can care to comment about the ethical issues of Monsanto, obviously, particularly on the issue of artificial engineering seeds. You can comment on that. My second question is it wise for China to replicate the business model of Monsanto in China? And my last question is, if I'm to invest a little farm for my future retirement, where should I buy? Obviously not in the U.S. because they have capital gain tax there.
How come you get to ask 3 questions?
So the first part of the first question was around the ethics of Monsanto, who are a good company. I think the real question is, do I think it's ethical to genetically modify seeds? And the short answer to that is yes. I mean, we've been modifying seeds for hundreds of years. We do it in a fairly haphazard way via selective breeding. Gene technology allows that to be done in a much more precise and much quicker way. So it's just like saying, some people make rude phone calls, so we'll ban mobile phones. Second one is related to China. I have been puzzled as to why China has not embraced gene technology more rapidly. My own conclusion is that they believe in the technology, but they are unwilling to be totally dependent on a small number of Western companies. So I know that they've done field-scale trials in China on at least 15 different crops. So I think when China has its own technology, you will see it more readily adopted, particularly in things like drought-resistant crops related to the water table issues. And the third question is, where should you retire? Go where land is cheap. I think you'll do very well in Mozambique, for example.
That was the answer you were expecting, wasn't it?
Question over there.
Yes, sir. In the back.
Thank you. First of all, the gentleman can buy a farm in Germany from me if he wants. I've got it for sale. It's not cheap, though.
We're going to create a market right here today.
Great market. Can you just comment a little bit on the organic food industry? It started out as a bit of a household industry. It's become a bit of a fad in many countries, but it's becoming industrialized with countries like Poland and further east producing a lot of that. What's your view on that? Is it just a short-term thing?
Yeah, we don't participate in the organic movement. Don't have a particular point of view on it. For me, it's more you're making a lifestyle choice rather than anything else. My wife will occasionally buy organic food, and I roll my eyes and ask her how much it costs. But I think we have seen in the UK, for example, two things happened. One is organic milk was at a premium, and then a lot of people dived in, and then the premium eroded. But then secondly, as the financial crisis hit, the willingness of people to pay a premium for organic food also disappeared. And it's wrapped up with the whole local movement. So the interesting thing about organic from our perspective, it is not so much is organic good or bad, but as people require products that are not distinguished by any inherent characteristic, the global commodity system is incredibly efficient at moving fungible products around the world. But if you start to say, well, I want this particular specification, and somebody else says, I want that specification, and the two cannot be commingled, it has a huge impact on the efficiency of the system. We saw that with the non-GM movement, where if people say, well, I'll buy Brazilian beans because they're not soybeans, they're not genetically modified. Well, today they are. If you want true identity preservation in an efficient bulk commodity system, that's extremely expensive. So I think organic is there. It's about 2 to 3% in Western Europe, more for some products, but it feels as if it's stalled a bit.
I have a question about population growth. In your models, is it strictly an input, or do you ever contemplate the fact that how good a job you do will actually affect population growth?
Oh. So the more efficient we get, the more babies people can have? Is that? No, we haven't included that in our models. I mean, we take the demographics, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand the demographics and what happens to food consumption patterns at different demographic levels, but we take that as a given. So we don't say that and largely we don't deal direct with the consumer as a firm, not exclusively, but largely. The companies who do a lot of work on those sorts of things are the Nestlés and the Unilevers of this world. So.
You talked about interference from the government sector. If we were to see a rollback in a lot of government interference, tariffs, etc., what do you think are the largest, events that would occur, whether that be pricing or more planting occurring for the global agricultural sector?
Yeah, I think agriculture is a long-term industry, and so when I say rollback, there is a role for government, there is a role for regulation. We don't talk about a free-for-all, but we want logical regulation that is well-crafted and the consequences are understood. And if you do that, I think you would end up with more land under production, better productivity, an increase in those flows. And some people say, well, of course you'd say that as Cargill, you're the biggest shipper of that stuff, but because of this land versus people and people versus land dynamic, it's inevitable that you will see big increases in shipments out of Africa, massive shipments out of the former Soviet Union, that whole Black Sea basin, because they have fabulous land, and that's not where the populations are. So crafting a set of global policies where those things can happen in the most effective manner will enable and help avoid food crises. We saw in 2008, when you had the very sharp price rally, 47 or 48 governments around the world imposed some form of new temporary export ban, new tariffs that actually contributed to the problem. In 2010, when there was another weather-related rally, there was far less of that. So we take that as some progress, at least.
So a question here. Okay, sir.
Do you see any especially important to grain production changes in weather patterns for the coming 10 years compared to the last 10 or 20? Some authorities claim that the last 10 or 20 were especially favorable, and the coming 10 maybe are not going to be.
We wonder about that. I mean, our weather events that will have a big impact somewhere becoming the new normal. So we had a very bad growing season in North America last year. The previous year you had droughts in Russia and floods in Australia. It felt at the time that there was an unusually high occurrence. There's always a weather problem somewhere in the world, but unusually high occurrence. Is that related to climate change? We're not sure. We're somewhat agnostic about it. The point that I've said to various groups is, stocks were reducing as a percentage of global use for several years leading up to 2008. So what happened in 2008 was entirely predictable. And then you get some weather events that took us over the edge. We've struggled to rebuild stocks since 2008 because we've had this series of weather events. So if we get 2 good Northern Hemisphere harvests and 2 good Southern Hemisphere harvests, we will be in a much more stable position. And from a much more stable position, any shortfall in a particular crop won't necessarily have the same sort of price response as we've seen recently because stocks are so low. But we're watching and observing, but are a bit agnostic about, are we going to have, is the pattern going to be a major weather event in 1 or 2 places every year? The climate change, people would say that is likely. And it's very, climate change is a hundreds of year phenomenon, so it's very difficult to say whether 2008 to 10 is just a blip.
I have 2 questions. One is on food safety. How do you think those standards will be developed internationally? Will there be a global standard? And how important is traceability as a part of that? And then the second question is on food security. How do you think governments will respond to that? Is it really just building up structural increase in stockpiles, or will there be other responses? Yeah.
So there is something called the Codex Alimentarius that I referred to. We support that. We sponsor a program which Chinese government scientists in food safety are taken to the US and to the EFSA in Europe to try and get people to realize that harmonized standards are the right way to go. But there is a body exists to do that. The problem is there's a lot of nationalism in food-related issues, whether that is the French, I can say that as an Englishman, or the Japanese, or the Indian. Everyone is very nationalistic about this. And so, but it is making progress. And even in some of the US industry things, they're following the Codex Alimentarius. What you need to accelerate that is to have some phytosanitary problem. And so far, it's low-level problems. There haven't been massive disputes. There are products that are used in the production of livestock in the US that are not approved in Korea or China, for example. And so there needs, a forum to resolve those would be useful. Because the person who's using a product such as ractopamine that is approved as safe and somebody else bans it, the people who are using it, it's safe and it's used in their domestic market, say, well, that's just a trade barrier by another name. So that's the first question. Follow Codex Alimentarius. The issue about what governments are doing, there are some people say we should go back to what we saw in the 70s and early 80s when you had, those of you who remember, they had these commodity agreements with these international agencies that ran these stocks. It was a complete disaster. Governments controlling food stocks are very inefficient, and it will mean if governments decided to do that, the amount of stocks needed to run the system would be much higher than it is if the private sector do it. There needs to be some minimum stocks, but the key thing is to have this regulatory environment that I've described. The other thing is it's far easier for, instead of government saying, well, we'll force you not to sell at a higher price because we're worried people can't afford it, then do an indirect or a direct subsidy to the people who are poor, either in cash or in kind. And it's in India is going through an extremely interesting exercise where every member of the population of India is going to have a personal identification, including their retina scan, that will enable far more targeted delivery of assistance to the very poor than they've traditionally had. They managed, I think 200 million people were signed up to this thing in 2011 and registered, and there's 400 million people going to be registered this year. And so there are much better ways to provide government assistance to the poor than to have huge stockpiles of food that you're running.
Thanks for that presentation, very interesting. We saw the massive growth in South America production. First question, do you think that can continue, or maybe we reach a level where the land that was available has been used already? And second, if you could buy land in Brazil or Argentina. I'm from Argentina as well.
I know. I was about to say, is there anyone from Argentina in the room? Then I suddenly Argentina has enormous potential, and everything that your government is doing now is damaging that. Okay? Let's call a spade a spade. So there's a lot more potential in Argentina, there's a lot more potential in Paraguay, and then Brazil, forget the rainforest, don't go anywhere near the rainforest. If you just take the Cerrado, I mean, Brazilian production of beef is incredibly extensive, and if you just took 10% of that pasture land and converted it to cropland, it's enormous, the potential. So Latin America still has a long way to go. It's a huge success story, by and large. But no, we're nowhere near the end.
Great, thanks a lot. Very interesting. You mentioned biodiesel earlier.
Yeah.
It seems it's perplexing given it seems very uneconomical. How sustainable do you think these policies are that are encouraging grains to be used to produce biodiesel?
At $125 crude oil, which is, for most of the world, including, by the way, I mean, a lot of people on either coast of the US are faced with $125, the WTI number is relevant to a fairly small geographic area. So as long as crude stays up at those sort of numbers, it is economically viable. If crude goes to 70 or 80, then it's a different story. In Europe, on biodiesel specifically, it's about 12.5 million tons, probably going to 16, and almost 100% of that delta, the 3.5 million tons, will not be grown in Europe. It'll either be coming from palm methyl ester from Asia, Africa, or Argentinian oil. Argentina has this interesting regulation where they're called differential export taxes. So if you export soybeans, that's one tax. If you export refined oil, that's another tax. And if you export biodiesel, it's even less. So if you're in that industry, you effectively have to be a biodiesel producer, otherwise you're uncompetitive. But it's all driven by crude. I mean, you have an alliance of farmers, the Greens, and governments willing to provide subsidies. Now, the green element of that is rather shaky at the moment. A lot of the green NGOs in Europe are questioning the greenness of biofuel policies. Our feeling is we've probably seen the peak in growth, but the industry's so big it won't go away, but you won't see the explosive growth that you've seen in the last 5 or 6 years.
First question is on Russia and the latent opportunity in the Soviet Union now that you have somewhat of this bottleneck getting addressed with United Grain Corp. So how is that market, how do you see that market evolving over the next 3 years, especially among a trading house perspective? And then secondly, it was brought up a few times, one of the trading houses is following an integrated model, expanding and owning the vertical. Maybe you can just give some of your insights on that. Thank you.
It's amazing how many questions people get it. So Russia, yeah, we're very bullish on. I mean, Russia has fantastic soil. I mean, it's just incredibly rich soil. The problem in Russia, as in Brazil, so if you have a product that is going to be exported and you get a price at the export port, the price an internal farmer in America will get is much higher than in Brazil or in Russia because the efficiency of the system. So what is lacking in Russia is the infrastructure around moving that product, and that really hasn't got any better in the last 20 years. I first started going to Russia in the mid-'80s. The second concern in Russia has just been the political environment. I mean, we've been with physical assets on the ground there since '93, and the political environment and potential for interference is as high as it's ever been. So after the 2008 crisis, they announced that they were going to set up a state-owned major trading company that would have a 30% market share, and you kind of thought, well, how are we going to compete with that? So it gets set up, and 2 years later, they're offering it for sale for anyone. So just that policy environment about how can you invest in a plant and a system of infrastructure when you don't know what the policy will changes. And that's the same in any industry. Your ability to invest is based on your confidence, not only on the margins, but on the policy environment. And Russia has had a pretty unstable policy environment. Your second question was about integrated trade houses. I think most trading houses are more integrated than they used to be because the ability to be a desk-traced screen trader, and just be 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year smarter than the next guy, we certainly can't do that. And so the idea is that you try and own the pinch points or anticipate which will be the pinch points in the system, and that's where you place your bets. The big one is obviously Glencore via their IPO. They have gone back into natural resources via the mining ownership. How much will that change? Will Xstrata mines get a worse price by selling to Glencore than to selling to an independent? I don't think so. And Glencore, so far on the ag side, is certainly not intending to be a farmer. So it's trying to integrate these supply chains, as shown on the chart, is important to make them more efficient. Different companies will operate in different parts of that supply chain. There are very few areas where the entire supply chain, because then do you go to the consumer? I don't think Glencore's going to make cars, for example.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. There's one way in the back of the room here.
Thanks. Just two quick questions for you. One, with the significant investment needed in agriculture, which areas specifically between equipment, fertilizer, seed technology, et cetera, do you see being dominating that future investment? And then secondly, when will Cargill go public? Thank you.
So actually, 10 years ago, the thought was that because of biotechnology, that particular piece would dominate the whole agribusiness supply chain, and it hasn't happened. There was talk that ourselves and other people would just be a distribution arm for Monsanto, and they would decide what margins we had. That hasn't happened. So there is investment needed all along the chain, and increasingly, I think it is probably at the front end, closer to the farmer. But I don't think you're going to see one segment of the chain dominate. As to when Cargill will go public, management don't think the nature of these businesses suit public companies. They're very volatile. Our earnings, which are published, have been pretty lumpy, up and down the last couple of years. And as long as being a public company requires that type of quarterly steady stage, we're not sure that being public suits these. Our shareholders basically agree with us. So as long as they and management agree, then we wouldn't go public. Some of the shareholders, and just be clear, there are no Cargill or Macmillans working in Cargill today. They leave us nearly 90% of the cash flow to reinvest in the business, and there aren't many public companies that can do that. So with the law of compounding, our net worth, if we do a reasonable job, we double our net worth every 7 to 8 years. We don't have to be fantastic, we just have to be reasonable. It's the power of compounding. And so a couple of the shareholders said to me, if we ever felt that being private was negative for the future of the company, we'd change it. But they don't think that, and nor do we. So for me, it's not a question of when. We don't think it makes sense.
I thought you were going to say it would be a cold day in hell, but
No.
you didn't say that.
A cold day in Minnesota. Yeah, same thing, yeah. There was one at the back over there.
Hi, you talked about South America. I come from Australia, which is another enormous country that, with not terribly many people in it. I mean, are we doing a good enough job? Can we contribute to more food to the world, and if so, how so?
Yeah, I mean, Australia is an enormous country with a bloody great desert in the middle of it. So it's a great place. I think Aussie agriculture is pretty efficient. We bought some of the grain assets of the Australian Wheat Board last September. Certainly more that can be done. And I think the big advantage Australia has is its geographic proximity to where the destination markets are. So I think Australia has more potential, clearly, and it has a geographic advantage, as it does on iron ore. But the principal crop it grows is wheat, and there's a lot of competition in the world of wheat. I mean, wheat being a grass is unlike, say, corn or soybeans, where there's really only a few countries that the supply can come from. There's Canada, Australia, the whole Black Sea basin. So I don't think Australia has quite the same advantages in terms of food products that it has in terms of iron ore. The other thing is that it's an expensive place, especially with the Aussie dollar where it is. So if you have any form of labor-intensive industry, it's an expensive place. We done?
Thank you very much, Willie. One of my colleagues at the table wanted me to ask you whether you're a rugby fan and whether you're going to the Hong Kong Sevens.
Yes, and yeah. I played rugby from when I was 8 till 35, hence the broken nose. But I love it. So Bob and I are going tomorrow afternoon.
We'll see it tomorrow. This is such an important topic. This topic that we've been discussing today, that Paul's been kind enough to share his knowledge and expertise on, is critical to world peace and critical to world security. And I know that Cargill, by virtue of its extraordinary, as one of the largest corporations in the world, and given the platform from which you operate, have the ability to be an enormously important part of the solution to what is truly a global problem. So thank you very much for being with us and sharing, and thank all of you for being with us this afternoon. Thank you.